They sealed the doors, they posted armed guards at every entrance, and they swore an oath that what happened inside that room would never be spoken aloud. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you what really happened behind those doors. The number one secret on this list stayed buried for over 50 years. But before we get there, you need to see what these men actually did when they thought nobody was watching. These are the 20 darkest secrets of the Founding Fathers. The things the history books left out, the things they buried, and the things they hoped you would never find. From a set of teeth hiding a monstrous truth, all the way down to a locked room where the future of human slavery was decided in silence. This list starts at number 20, and it gets worse with every single entry. You were told George Washington had wooden teeth. That's the version they put in children's books. In 1784, a ledger entry at Mount Vernon recorded a very specific purchase, 9 teeth. The seller was not a dentist. Washington bought those teeth from enslaved people on his own plantation. He paid 122 shillings for 9 human teeth pulled from the mouths of people he owned. And then he wore them in his mouth while delivering speeches about liberty and the rights of free men. Every painting of Washington smiling is hiding someone else's teeth. Give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry shouted those 7 words in a church in Richmond, Virginia in 1775. Those 7 words lit the fuse of the American Revolution. When Patrick Henry died in 1799, he owned 67 enslaved human beings. He freed not a single one, not in his life, not in his will. In a private letter, he admitted he knew slavery was wrong. His exact word for why he wouldn't end it: inconvenient. Liberty or death, unless it was inconvenient. John Hancock's signature on the Declaration of Independence is the most famous autograph in American history. What made that signature possible was a criminal empire. Hancock was the biggest smuggler in colonial New England. His ship, named Liberty, of all things, was seized by British customs in 1768 for smuggling Madeira wine. Hancock had been dodging import taxes for years. It was how he built the largest fortune in Massachusetts. The man who bankrolled the American Revolution was, by every definition of British law, a career criminal. He signed his name that large because he'd had years of practice signing fake shipping manifests. Benjamin Franklin is remembered as an abolitionist who changed his mind about slavery late in life. That's the redemption arc they give you. What they leave out is what he did for decades before that change of heart. Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, ran advertisements for the sale of enslaved human beings for over 30 years. He personally profited from every ad. He also owned enslaved people in his own household. The man who would later call slavery an atrocious debasement of human nature spent 3 decades making money selling column inches to slave traders. Every edition his press printed carried somebody's price tag. The Sons of Liberty are taught as brave rebels who stood up to British tyranny. Samuel Adams helped organize them. John Hancock helped fund them. What they actually did in the streets of Boston was something else entirely. They tarred and feathered British loyalists. That phrase sounds almost cartoonish until you understand what it actually means. Boiling pine tar, hot enough to melt skin on contact, was poured over a person's naked body. Then feathers were pressed into the open burns. Removing the tar afterward ripped away skin and flesh. People died from this, and the Founding Fathers called it patriotism. The Revolution had heroes. Some of them were also torturers. John Adams, the man who helped build the argument for American independence, the man who championed the Bill of Rights. In 1798, he signed a law that made it a federal crime to criticize the President of the United States. His own office, his own reputation, protected by prison. The Sedition Act sent newspaper editors to jail for publishing opinions against the government. A sitting congressman was arrested and convicted for calling Adams's policies ridiculous. Ordinary citizens were fined for speaking against the president in public. 7 years after ratifying the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech, the President of the United States was locking people up for using it. The man who fought for freedom of the press became the first American president to destroy it. James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. In 1787, he helped design one of the most grotesque mathematical equations in human history. They called it the Three-Fifths Compromise. Enslaved people could not vote, could not own property, could not testify in court. They were legally property. But Madison helped ensure each enslaved person counted as 3/5 of a human being for the purpose of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more seats in Congress, more electoral votes, and more raw political power. All of it built on counting people they refused to recognize as people. Madison didn't just tolerate slavery, he turned human beings into political currency. Everything I just showed you, the teeth, the smuggling, the torture, the prison sentences, that was the foundation. Starting with number 13, these aren't abstract policies anymore. These are things that happened to specific people who had names, who had faces, who made choices that the founders tried to erase from history. And one of those people connects directly to the number one secret on this list. In May of 1796, a 22-year-old woman named Ona Judge climbed out of a window in the president's house in Philadelphia and disappeared. She was enslaved by George Washington. She had been Martha Washington's personal attendant since childhood. And on that night, she decided she would rather risk death than spend one more day as presidential property. Washington didn't let it go. The most powerful man in America, the sitting president of the United States, launched a years-long campaign to recapture one woman. He dispatched federal agents to New Hampshire, where Ona had fled. He wrote personal letters to his contacts, demanding her return. He even attempted to have her quietly kidnapped and shipped back to Virginia by boat. Ona Judge refused every offer and every threat. She told an interviewer years later that she would rather suffer anything than go back, even if it meant going back to the man the whole nation called the father of their country. Washington never got her back. He died in 1799, still listing her as his property. Ona Judge died free in New Hampshire in 1848. She outlived him by 49 years. Thomas Jefferson kept a book. He titled it his farm book. It was not about crops. Page after page in his own meticulous handwriting, Jefferson recorded the names, ages, births, deaths, and daily work output of every enslaved human being at Monticello. Over 600 souls, reduced to inventory lines in a leather ledger. Jefferson recorded when enslaved children reached working age. He tracked which women gave birth and how quickly they returned to the fields. He calculated the dollar value of babies born into bondage on his own land. At night, the same man sat in his private library surrounded by Enlightenment philosophy and wrote long essays about natural rights and the dignity of the human soul. He read John Locke by candlelight and counted human beings by daylight. One name appears in that ledger again and again: Sally. Remember that name. What Jefferson did to Sally is coming at number 4, and it will change how you see everything. Benjamin Franklin had a son named William. William was the royal governor of New Jersey, powerful, respected, and devoted to his father. When the Revolution forced every man to choose a side, William stayed loyal to the British crown. Benjamin chose the Revolution, and then Benjamin chose to destroy his own child. William was arrested by the Continental Congress and thrown into a prison in Connecticut for 2 years. He endured solitary confinement in conditions so harsh his health never fully recovered. Benjamin Franklin, the man who charmed kings, who negotiated treaties, who wrote about tolerance and reason and forgiveness, never once intervened to help his own son. After the war, they met one final time in England. Benjamin's only demand was that William sign over all his remaining American property as punishment for choosing the wrong side. William signed. They never spoke to each other again. William Franklin died alone in exile in London in 1813. The last letter he sent his father was never opened. Alexander Hamilton is America's favorite abolitionist, founder, the orphan immigrant who hated slavery. That is the Broadway version. The ledger entries Hamilton left behind tell a story the musical will never stage. Hamilton married into the Schuyler family, one of the largest slaveholding dynasties in New York. Historians have found entries in Hamilton's own financial papers that appear to record the purchase of enslaved human beings. He managed slave transactions for his in-laws. He lived in a household staffed by enslaved servants, ate the meals they cooked, slept in beds they made. The real Alexander Hamilton, not the character singing about freedom on a Broadway stage, knew the names of the people his family owned, and he signed the receipts. The revolution will not be accurately dramatized. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the man George Washington personally chose to define American justice, held a second title. He was president of the New York Manumission Society, an organization whose entire mission was the abolition of slavery. While leading that society, Jay personally owned enslaved people. He kept them in his household throughout his years of public service. He would attend morning meetings about the moral evil of slavery and return home to a house where enslaved workers served his dinner. And Jay wasn't alone. Other members of the Manumission Society owned enslaved people too. The organization dedicated to ending slavery was led by slaveholders who saw no contradiction in going home to the very system they met to condemn. The first man to sit on America's highest court couldn't see the injustice in his own dining room. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay a federal tax on whiskey. These were poor men, many of them Revolutionary War veterans who had bled for independence from an unjust government. Now their own government was taxing them the same way Britain had. They believed the revolution gave them the right to resist. George Washington's response was to personally ride at the head of 13,000 troops, an army larger than what he'd commanded in most battles of the Revolution itself, and march them into western Pennsylvania to crush the rebellion by force. He sent that army against his own citizens, against men who had served under him at Valley Forge and Yorktown. The man who built his legend, rebelling against a government that taxed without consent, now sent bayonets against men who believed they were being taxed without fair representation. 20 people were arrested. 2 were sentenced to hang. Washington pardoned them, but only after the message was delivered at the point of a sword. The revolution was supposed to be for them. The government it created was not. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed a law. Any enslaved person brought into the state and kept there for more than 6 months would be legally and automatically free. When Philadelphia became the nation's temporary capital in 1790, George Washington brought 9 enslaved people to staff the president's house. He knew the law, he knew the clock was ticking, and he found a loophole. Every 6 months, just before the legal deadline, Washington quietly rotated his enslaved workers out of Pennsylvania and back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. Then he brought them back, resetting the clock to 0. He did this deliberately, repeatedly, and in complete secrecy. His own attorney general told him the scheme was ethically bankrupt. Washington did it anyway. He wrote instructions to his personal secretary demanding it be done quietly, so the public and the enslaved people themselves wouldn't realize what was happening. The President of the United States was running a covert operation, not against a foreign army, not against British spies, but to prevent the people living in his own house from becoming free. One of the people Washington rotated was Ona Judge, the same woman from number 13. She eventually figured out what he was doing. That's why she ran. If you've made it this far, you already know more about what the Founding Fathers actually did than most Americans will learn in their entire lives. Hit subscribe, because next week's video goes even deeper into the darkest founder of them all. And the number 1 entry on this list? I have not seen a single mainstream history channel cover what I'm about to tell you. We the people of the United States. Those 3 words are carved into marble courthouses, printed on currency, recited by every schoolchild in America. But when the men who wrote those words sat down in 1787, they defined the word people with surgical precision, and most of the human beings living in America did not make the cut. Women could not vote. Enslaved people were classified as property. Indigenous nations were treated as foreign enemies on their own land. And in most states, white men who didn't own property were barred from the ballot box. When the Constitution was ratified, roughly 6% of the total American population was eligible to participate in the democracy it established. The founders didn't accidentally leave anyone out. They sat in a closed room, drew the lines deliberately, and built a republic of, by, and for wealthy white men who held land deeds. Everyone else was scenery. We the people was a promise made by men who meant we the 6%. George Washington owned over 50,000 acres of frontier land. Benjamin Franklin helped found companies whose sole purpose was acquiring territory. Patrick Henry speculated on land he'd never even visited. Dozens of founding fathers were neck-deep in land deals, buying up millions of acres of indigenous territory, often before treaties were signed or the ink on them was dry. Washington dispatched personal surveyors ahead of official treaty negotiations to claim the most valuable parcels before anyone else could. Franklin helped establish the Ohio Company, a speculation venture designed to buy indigenous land at a fraction of its value and sell it to settlers at massive markups. For many of these men, the revolution wasn't purely about freedom from Britain. British policy had restricted westward expansion to honor treaties with indigenous nations. Independence meant removing those restrictions. It meant open season on the frontier. Liberty, for some of the men who signed the Declaration, meant the liberty to take land that didn't belong to them and sell it for profit. The pursuit of happiness, it turned out, required someone else's homeland. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson was living in Paris as the American ambassador to France. A girl arrived that year to accompany his young daughter on the ocean voyage from Virginia. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old, she was enslaved, and she was the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife Martha, both of them fathered by the same man, John Wales. Sally Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's legal property. What began in Paris between a 44-year-old ambassador and a 14-year-old girl he legally owned was not a love story, no matter how many history books frame it that way. Under Virginia law, Sally Hemings was not a person. She was property. She could not consent. She could not refuse. She could not leave. In 1998, DNA evidence confirmed what the Jefferson family had denied for 2 centuries. Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Sally Hemings' children. He kept her enslaved for his entire life. He freed some of their children in his will. He never freed her. The author of American Liberty kept the mother of his own children in bondage until the day he died. Monticello had 2 levels. Upstairs, a man wrote about freedom. In the rooms beneath his feet, his own children were born into slavery. The Constitution of the United States, the single most celebrated document of human freedom in the Western world, contains a clause that compelled the return of escaped enslaved people to their owners. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3. They didn't use the word slave. They carefully chose the phrase person held to service or labor. The euphemism was deliberate. What this meant was simple and devastating. If an enslaved person ran, if they fled across hundreds of miles of wilderness in the dark, risked death by exposure, by dogs, by bullets, and they reached a free state, a place where slavery was illegal, the Constitution of the United States required that state to capture them and send them back. Freedom had a geographic limit, and the founders drew the line. This was not an oversight. It was a negotiated deal. Southern delegates told the convention they would walk out and there would be no constitution and no country without this clause. Northern delegates looked across the table and agreed. They decided that a united nation was worth more than the freedom of every person in chains, and they wrote that decision into the supreme law of the land. The document of American freedom was also a warrant for the capture of anyone who tried to escape slavery. And that leads us directly to the man who wrote the sentence that started all of it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson wrote those words in June of 1776, sitting in a rented room on Market Street in Philadelphia. His hand moved across the paper, forming letters that would reshape the entire world. And at that exact moment, that same week, that same day, back at Monticello in Virginia, over 100 enslaved men, women, and children were working his tobacco fields in the summer heat. His overseers were watching them. His ledger was counting them. Over the course of his 73 years, Thomas Jefferson enslaved more than 600 human beings. He sold enslaved people to cover his personal debts. He ordered families separated when it was financially convenient. His overseers administered whippings that Jefferson documented in his own records. He noted the infractions and the punishments in the same ledger where he tracked crop yields. And when he died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration was adopted, his will freed 7 people, 7 out of more than 600. Every single one of the 7 was a member of the Hemings family, Sally's children and relatives. Every other human being he had ever owned was sold at auction to pay the debts he had accumulated building Monticello and living in luxury. He wrote the word equal with one hand and signed a bill of sale with the other. And now, the number one secret, the one they locked behind sealed doors and guarded for half a century, and the number one dark secret of the Founding Fathers, May 25th, 1787, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 55 men walked through the doors of the Pennsylvania State House, and those doors were locked behind them. The windows were nailed shut, in the dead of summer, in brutal heat, with no ventilation, so that no one standing outside could hear a single word of what was being said. Armed guards were stationed at every entrance, and before a single piece of business was discussed, every delegate in that room swore a binding oath of absolute secrecy. What happened over the next 4 months inside that sealed chamber would produce the United States Constitution, the supreme law of the most powerful nation on earth, and the American public was forbidden from knowing any of it. Inside those walls, the delegates debated slavery, not whether to regulate it, whether to end it. Gouverneur Morris, the man who actually penned the final words of the Constitution, stood up and called slavery a nefarious institution and the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. George Mason, himself a Virginia slaveholder, warned the entire convention that slavery would bring the judgment of heaven on this country. There were real proposals placed on the table to begin immediate abolition. And then the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia drew a hard line. They would leave. There would be no Constitution. There would be no United States of America. The room went quiet, and the Northern delegates made their choice. They chose the Union over abolition. They wrote the 3/5 Compromise into Article 1. They wrote the Fugitive Slave Clause into Article 4. They wrote a 20-year federal protection of the transatlantic slave trade into the document, guaranteeing it could not be banned before 1808. They chose to build a nation on the preservation of slavery, and then they sealed the room and swore every man present to silence. One man in that room, James Madison, kept meticulous secret notes. Every argument, every debate, every moment, the founders had the chance to end slavery and chose not to. He never published a single page. He left strict instructions in his will. The notes could only be released after he was dead. James Madison died in 1836. His secret journal of the Constitutional Convention was finally published 4 years later in 1840, 53 years after those doors were sealed. For more than half a century, the American people had no idea that their founding fathers had stared slavery in the face, debated ending it, and made the deliberate, calculated decision to look away. The room where they wrote American freedom is the same room where they voted to keep 4 million people in chains. And then they locked the doors, posted the guards, and swore an oath that you would never find out. And the man who sat in that room longer than almost anyone else, the man who kept his mouth shut for all of it, was Benjamin Franklin. He took secrets to his grave that make everything on this list look tame. 20 shocking things Ben Franklin actually did that they never taught you. That video is right here.